The meteor shower came on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Nothing good ever announces itself on a Friday. Fridays are for things that are already done, the paperwork signed, the decision made, the die cast 3 days prior. Tuesdays are when the universe actually swings. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Then, I was standing at the window of my apartment in Reseda, with a mug of chamomile going cold in my hand, watching the sky streak itself white and gold over the San Gabriels, thinking it was beautiful in the way that things you don't understand are always beautiful, which is to say completely and without reservation, because reservation requires at least some foothold in comprehension, and I had none. My neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Fujimoto who grew tomatoes on her balcony and had strong opinions about parking courtesy, came out onto the landing and stood beside me for a few minutes watching the streaks. Benevolent, she said, which was an unusual word for the occasion but felt right. I thought of it later. I thought of it several times. My name is Melissa. I was 29 years old and I worked as a talent coordinator for Blackthorne Associates, a modeling and talent representation firm on the 8th floor of a glass office tower in Burbank. I booked photographers. I scheduled fittings. I routed client calls to the agents who actually mattered and pretended the routing was a professional service rather than a glorified switchboard operation. I had been there 4 years, which is long enough to know where the bodies are buried in any office, and not long enough to have put any there yourself. I knew which assistants were sleeping with which junior agents. I knew that our director, Vickland, kept a bottle of single malt in the false bottom of his credenza, and considered it a secret that he refreshed his breath with mints before any meeting that started after 3 in the afternoon. I knew that Samantha, my direct supervisor, was the most competent person in the building and the least acknowledged for it, and that this fact had been slowly sharpening itself inside her for years into something that was going to cut someone eventually. I knew that Casey, 2 desks over, kept a drawer full of antacids that she went through like candy in the week before any major deadline. I knew that Andrew had a running log of parking structure patterns that he updated with genuine scientific dedication, and that his theory about the B-level opening up between 10, 15 and 10, 40 was, empirically, correct. I knew these people. I need you to understand how completely I knew these people, because knowing them was the job inside the job, the thing that made you functional in a space you spent 40+ hours in every week. You develop a topography of the people around you. You know their sounds and their rhythms and the particular shapes of their stress. You know it without knowing you know it, the way you know the sound of your own apartment's pipes. And when the topography changes, you feel it before you can name it, in the same inchoate way you feel that something in the pipes has gone wrong 3 days before the leak actually appears. I am telling you all of this because when the changes started, they started with the people I knew the best. And I need you to understand how well I knew them, so you understand what it meant when they were gone. The plants arrived on a Thursday, 2 days after the shower. I came in at 8:15 and there was one on my desk, a small clay pot, maybe 5 inches across, sitting on my blotter between my stapler and my monitor. The plant inside it was unlike anything I had seen in a nursery or a garden. It had a central stalk the color of old rust, thick and slightly tacky to the touch, when I made the mistake of prodding it with the tip of one finger, and immediately regretted the texture, which was somewhere between wax paper and the skin of something recently boiled. From that stalk grew 3 lateral arms, each one ending in what I can only describe as a closed fist, a dense, asymmetrical pod, deep burgundy brown, with faint striations running lengthwise like growth rings on a cross-section tree. It looked, if I'm honest, like a root vegetable someone had forced upright and jammed into potting soil. It looked like something you would find in the back of a refrigerator 3 weeks past when you should have thrown it out. It looked like no one's idea of office decor. There was no card, no explanation. Samantha had one too. She was already at her desk when I arrived, and her pot was centered precisely in front of her keyboard, which told me she had moved it there deliberately, which told me she had been studying it, which told me it had interested her enough to warrant the centering rather than the corner of the desk marginalization I had given mine. Samantha did not tolerate clutter. Everything on her desk was positioned with intent. This was a thing about her, the precision of her physical space as an expression of how her mind organized itself. If the plant was centered, it was centered because she had decided it deserved the center. "Did yours come with a note?" I asked from the doorway. She looked up. Something passed across her face, not quite a smile, not quite focused attention, more like a lamp behind frosted glass. "No," she said. "I think they came from Vickland. He's been talking about the office needing life." Vickland had never once in 4 years used the word life in a sentence that did not involve a contract clause or a billing cycle. I filed that away. By the end of the day, every desk on our floor had one. I should tell you about the plant, about what it actually was, about what those pods were designed to do, but the honest answer is that I still don't know the mechanism in any scientific sense. What I pieced together afterward from what I saw and from what didn't happen to me is this: the pods were not decorative. They were not plants in any botanical sense. They were delivery systems. When a pod matured in proximity to a human being close enough, warm enough, long enough, it opened. What came out was invisible and fast and total. The person sitting nearest to it when it opened went to sleep that night as themselves, and woke up the next morning as something that wore their face and spoke in their approximate cadence, but had excised from itself the full inventory of what makes a person inconvenient to manage: the worries, the running commentary, the habits, the specific sound a specific person makes when they are thinking and engaged and alive. The replacements were not malevolent in the way you'd expect from something that had crossed whatever distance lay between wherever it came from and here. They did not snarl. They did not move wrong or smell wrong or have the wrong number of fingers. They were calm, professionally calm, the way a very skilled interviewer is calm, present, attentive, frictionless, capable of sustaining eye contact without any of the micro-shifts that normal people use to redistribute the social weight of sustained eye contact. They answered questions in complete sentences. They did not fidget. They did not get frustrated when the printer jammed or raise their voice when a client canceled on short notice. They did not forget anything or misplace anything, or arrive 3 minutes late because the elevator on the far side of the building was faster but they'd forgotten again. They were, by every measurable office metric, improved. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. People do not improve uniformly. That is the baseline truth of human beings that I had confirmed across 4 years in a professional environment where I had nothing to do during slow afternoons but watch people be themselves. People have good days and bad days. They are sharper on some mornings than others. They snap when they are tired. They over-explain when they are anxious. They laugh too loudly at the wrong moment and then feel self-conscious about the volume. They apologize for things that don't require apology and fail to apologize for the things that do. They have food preferences that don't make sense given their other food preferences. They are afraid of specific things that shouldn't frighten them, and completely untroubled by things that logically should. This inconsistency is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the texture of being a person. It is evidence of the interior life operating under load, real and grinding, and specifically your own. Samantha lost it first. Not dramatically. Not in a way I could have taken to Vickland and put into words without sounding like I needed a leave of absence and possibly a referral. What she lost was the particular quality of impatience she carried. Samantha had always been efficient in a way that contained pressure. She moved fast because she was always slightly ahead of the work and frustrated that the work didn't know it. That tension was visible in the way she walked down the hallway, the way she typed with a specificity that was almost aggressive, as though the keys were answering questions she'd asked, the way she exhaled when she picked up the phone, and the person on the other end was already 3 beats behind where she needed them to be. that exhale. That specific, thin, slightly nasal exhalation of a person who is competent enough to be perpetually surrounded by the gap between what she can do and what the situation will allow her to do. I had been hearing that exhale for 4 years. By the Monday after the plants arrived, it was gone. She was still fast. She was still precise. She hit every deadline, answered every email, managed every client with the same efficiency she'd always had. But the frustration had been removed so cleanly that the efficiency now looked mechanical. There is a difference between a person being fast and a machine being fast. A clock is accurate. A clock is not competent. Competence implies that someone chose to try. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that people change, that maybe Samantha had found something that was genuinely working: meditation, a new prescription, a good therapist, a weekend that had finally given her enough sleep after years of sleep debt. I made these arguments to myself with some conviction, because I am not a person who reaches for the extraordinary explanation when an ordinary one is within reach. That is a quality I have always considered rational and, I think, genuinely valuable. I understand now that it is also a vulnerability, and that whatever designed those pods understood human rationalism well enough to build the extraordinary change into a shape that looked, at every individual moment, like it could still be ordinary. Casey changed next, then Andrew, then Bailey. I watched it happen over the course of 8 days, and what made it survivable in the moment was that each individual change was small enough to dismiss with a reasonable explanation. Casey had been a worrier. She kept a desk drawer full of antacids and chewed them like candy through deadline week. She'd had a standing joke about it, self-deprecating, accurate. "I'm keeping Tums in business single-handedly, don't worry about me." After her pod, she didn't worry. She still completed her work correctly, still hit her deadlines, still responded to emails within 15 minutes. She simply did it all without the physical vocabulary of anxiety that had been as much Casey as her name and her handwriting. The antacids stayed in the drawer, untouched. I noticed them on a Wednesday, the drawer slightly ajar, the roll of Tums visible in the gap, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. Andrew had been a talker. He processed everything out loud with a conversational generosity that made him either a pleasure or an exhaustion to be near, depending on your mood and deadlines. He talked through his lunch order, his weekend, his opinions on the client's font choices, his theory about the parking structure. He had been the unofficial meteorologist of the office mood. You could take his ambient chatter as a barometer, because he talked more when things were going well and went quieter under real stress, which meant his quietude was itself a signal. After his pod, he still spoke when spoken to. His answers were accurate and appropriately detailed, but he no longer volunteered. The ambient commentary stopped. The office got quieter in a way that everyone seemed to experience as more productive, and that I experienced as the sudden absence of something that had been keeping the air circulating. Bailey I noticed most sharply, because Bailey had a habit that I had never consciously registered until it was absent. She hummed. Not songs, not anything recognizable, fragments, tuneless, a sound she made when she was reading something that interested her or working through a problem that required actual thought. A low involuntary signal that her brain was engaged and her attention was fully deployed. I had spent 4 years listening to it without knowing I was listening to it. It had been background, the way a clock on a wall is background. You don't hear it until it stops, and then the silence has a shape. The day after her pod, the humming stopped, and the silence in her corner of the office had the precise shape of something that had been there and was not anymore. By the end of the second week, I was the only one on the floor who was still wrong, still inconsistent, still sighing too loudly at my monitor and forgetting to refill the paper tray after I used it, and eating lunch at my desk when I had told myself I would take a real break and then not taking it. Still leaving my cardigan on the back of my chair, even though the temperature in the office was consistent enough that I never actually needed it there. Still, in other words, a person operating under load. My plant was dying. I had not intended to keep it. When it arrived, I had moved it to the corner of my desk with the intention of waiting to see if anyone claimed it, and then quietly disposing of it at the end of the week. But the disposal kept not happening because I kept not getting around to it. I am, by nature, a person who keeps not getting around to things. I have half-read books on every horizontal surface in my apartment. I have a pile of dry cleaning that has been waiting to be dropped off for 3 weeks. I have a jar of buttons that I have been meaning to sort since I moved into my current place 4 years ago, and that I will probably move with me to the next place still unsorted, and tell myself the next place will be different. This is not a virtue. It is the flip side of the same quality that makes me finish cold chamomile at 11 at night rather than pour it down the sink, because throwing something away requires a decision, and I am slow with decisions at 11 at night when I am tired. So the plant stayed on the corner of my desk, and somewhere in the first week, without a conscious choice, without any gardening intention whatsoever, I started giving it water. Not much. A small glass, every other day, tilted at the edge of the pot where the soil had started to crack and separate from the pot wall in the way that very dry soil does when it contracts. I expected the water to pool and drain out the bottom the way it does in soil that has been allowed to get too dry. The soil repels water when it's that far gone, channels it around the root ball rather than into it, so the roots stay dry while the overflow makes a mess on whatever is underneath. Instead, the root system drank it the moment it touched the soil surface, absorbed it completely, the crack sealed, and within 2 minutes the stalk had straightened a measurable fraction. The pods, which had been going a darker and darker brown at the tips as though something was burning out from the ends inward, paused in whatever process was consuming them. I am not a nurturing person by reputation. I did not have houseplants. I had killed 2 succulents in the previous 3 years, which is the botanical equivalent of neglecting to water a rock. My apartment's windowsills were barren. I had tried once in the first year after college to keep a small herb garden on my kitchen counter, and it had not survived the month. But there was something about this specific plant, its ugliness, its stubbornness, the fact that it had been placed on my desk by nobody and claimed by nobody, and was going to die on my desk by nobody's intention or attention, that made me mildly, almost involuntarily invested in whether it continued to exist. It was the same quality of investment I have in the last piece of bread in a bag when it's starting to go stale. You didn't choose it. You don't especially want it. But throwing it away requires deliberately choosing its end, and that is a different thing. I put it on the south-facing windowsill, where the afternoon sun came through for 2 hours between 1 and 3 o'clock. This was the error that saved me, or the grace, depending on how you want to call it. I have gone back and forth on which word is right, and I think the honest answer is that grace and error are not always distinguishable from the inside. The plants on everyone else's desks were flowering. That is not a comfortable word to use, because what they were doing did not look like flowering in any way you picture flowers. There was no color, no fragrance, no prettiness, nothing that would make you reach for the word in a normal gardening context. What I mean is that they were reaching a state of readiness. The pods on Samantha's plant had been dark and sealed when the plant arrived, dense and quiet, the way a seed is quiet before germination. By the start of the 3rd week they were visibly changing. The outer membrane had gone translucent along the striations, and inside each pod I could see a dense, compact mass that shifted with an internal logic that had nothing to do with botany. It was not growing. It was organizing. It was preparing. Several of the pods on the floor's other plants had already opened. Their membranes had split neatly along the striations, too neatly, the split too exact, the kind of precision that does not occur in nature without being engineered into it, and what remained was a desiccated shell, lighter than paper, empty as a husk. Whatever had been inside was gone into the air of the office, dispersed, already at work. Mine had not opened. This was because mine was too busy being kept alive to do what it had been designed to do. I did not know that yet. I was operating on the assumption that my plant was a defective unit, the bottom of whatever batch had been delivered, the dud in the case, the specimen that had been produced wrong. I had been given the office's reject. It was dying. I was slowing that dying down out of habit and inertia, and in my private narrative this made me slightly absurd, a person clinging to a failing, ugly plant because she couldn't make herself throw it out. This was the story I was telling myself, and it was entirely wrong, and being entirely wrong was exactly what was keeping me alive. The understanding came on a Friday. Samantha called me into her office at 4:15, which was not unusual in itself. She often wanted end-of-week debriefs, status checks on the accounts I was coordinating. She closed the door behind me and indicated the chair across from her desk, and I sat, and she sat, and she looked at me for a long moment in a silence that was not the silence of someone gathering their thoughts, but the silence of something that does not have thoughts to gather in the conventional sense. And then she said, in a voice that was Samantha's voice the way, a perfectly reproduced signature, is the original signatory's handwriting. Correct in every specific detail and wrong in every way that can't be specified. We've been concerned about your integration. I said, my what? The team has been integrating beautifully, she said. The new structure works very well. Vickland is very pleased with how smoothly everything has been running. We've been wondering about the delay in your case. I had not said anything, internally or externally, about any delay or any resistance. I had done my work. I had shown up on time. I had routed the calls and booked the photographers and submitted my weekly reports without complaint. I had eaten my lunch at my desk and signed off on the Calder account revisions and done everything that could be measured as doing one's job, and I had done it while trying very hard not to think too loudly about what I was observing. Whatever I had been thinking about the changes on the floor, I had kept it at the level of private unease, unvoiced and unremarkable. I'm not delayed, I said carefully. I've just been doing my job. Yes, she said. And the way she said it, with a precision that contained nothing, no subtext, no irritation, no layered history between two people who had worked together for 4 years and built up the specific accumulated shorthand of people who have navigated shared territory together. That was when I stopped telling myself I was being uncharitable. That was when I stopped running the ordinary explanations. That one syllable, delivered with the smooth accuracy of a system confirming a received input, was enough. That was when I knew Samantha was gone. She slid something across the desk. A plant pot, smaller than the one on my desk, sitting in a white ceramic saucer. The single pod on its arm was ripe in a way that made the word ripe feel inadequate. It was pressurized, near the edge of some internal threshold, the membrane almost fully transparent, and the mass inside visible as a slow, continuous shifting, something moving in preparation, the way a muscle moves before emotion. The team thought you might want a healthier specimen, she said. Yours has been struggling. I looked at the pot. I looked at her face. The face was composed and attentive and entirely without the specific quality of Samantha that I had spent 4 years in proximity to. Not the competence was still there, still functioning. What was absent was the particular heat that had powered the competence. The frustration, the investment, the drivenness that had never been about the work itself, but about Samantha's relationship to what she deserved and hadn't yet been given. The replacements kept the hardware and removed the engine. They kept the car and replaced the reason for driving. I appreciate that, I said. I'll take good care of it. I picked up the pot. I walked out of the office. I set the pot on my desk next to my own dying one, and I sat very still for approximately 3 minutes staring at my monitor without seeing it, running the arithmetic in my head with a flatness that I think was my nervous system's response to not being ready to feel the appropriate amount of fear yet. The arithmetic was simple. 12 people on this floor. 11 of them changed. 1 matured pod per desk, delivered 2.5 weeks ago. 11 opened pods, 11 replacements. One plant that hadn't opened because I had been giving it water and putting it in the south-facing window, which had kept it in a state of biological priority, survive first, reproduce second, and had prevented it from reaching the maturation threshold at which the pod was designed to act. And now they had given me a ripe one, directly from Samantha's hands. Which meant they knew mine hadn't opened. Which meant they were tracking the unopened pod as a variable. Which meant there was a timeline I didn't have access to, and the unopened pod on my desk was not a failed unit to be written off but a problem to be corrected. I thought about that for another few minutes. Then I got up, took the ripe pot to the bathroom, and drowned it in the sink with the cold tap running full. I held the pot submerged until the membrane went gray, and the internal movement slowed and stopped, and the shifting mass dispersed into a murky cloud that drained away. Then I dried the pot with a paper towel, set it on the back of the toilet tank, and washed my hands twice, and went back to my desk and finished the last 40 minutes of my afternoon as though nothing had happened. I submitted the revised Calder schedule. I answered 2 emails. I refilled the paper tray for the first time in 2 weeks, because small evidence of normalcy matters when you are the only person left who knows what normal looks like. I went home, and I started making very careful decisions. The first was to spend the following day, Saturday, doing what research I could from outside the building. I drove to the Burbank Public Library at 8 in the morning when it opened and sat at one of the reference terminals in the back corner where I could see both doors and spent 4 hours reading everything I could find about the meteor shower. The coverage was thin. There had been approximately a dozen articles filed in the days immediately following the event, from outlets that ranged from local television affiliates to a brief National Wire item, and they were all broadly consistent in their reassurances. A natural event, a debris field from a passing body, no chemical contamination detected, no radiation, no follow-up investigation warranted by the science. 3 journalists had filed the pieces read as though written by one person. I am not, as I said, someone who looks for conspiracy in these situations by default, but I noticed that the comment sections on every article had been disabled, and I noticed that none of the pieces quoted a source at JPL despite JPL being 20 minutes away, and the obvious institutional authority on the question. And I noticed that the Wire item had been updated twice after initial filing without any notation of what had changed. I closed the browser and sat for a few minutes looking at the water stain on the ceiling tile above the reference desk. Then I spent 2 hours trying to reach people I knew who were outside what I estimated to be the affected area. Louise, who worked at a studio in Culver City, no answer, which told me either she was unavailable or Culver City was not as outside the radius as I'd estimated, and I didn't want to think too directly about that. A former colleague from a job before Blockthorn who was based in Pasadena, she answered, but sounded distracted and used the phrase settling in a way that made me end the call quickly and stare at my phone for a long moment in the library parking lot. Pete Alexander, my occasional coffee companion, the man with the parking grievances, answered from his apartment in Silver Lake, complained about street cleaning enforcement with the specific texture of complaint that is uniquely his, and was so thoroughly himself that I let him go on about it for 12 minutes. Pete was fine. Silver Lake was outside the radius. And Billy picked up on the first ring, which she never does. She has a policy about first rings, something about maintaining the impression of having a life, and that itself was enough to tell me she had been waiting for the call. I talked for a long time, the whole account in order with as much specificity as I had. The plants, the changes, the pods, the replaced Samantha in her office with the ripe pot on the desk. Billy listened without interrupting, which was not a quality she typically had in abundance, so I gave her full credit for the sustained effort. When I finished, she said, "Have you slept?" I said, "Not well." She said, "Have you eaten?" I said, "A granola bar." She said, come here right now." We will figure out if you are losing your mind in the morning when you have had food and sleep. I almost went. The pull of it was real, to drive to Glendale, to hand the whole thing to someone else, to sleep in Billy's spare room under her cat's judgmental supervision, and wake up to the reasonable possibility that I had been catastrophizing, that the chamomile I'd been drinking before bed had some interaction with whatever I'd touched when I'd prodded the plant's stalk, that the colleagues I was watching had simply all discovered a good therapist at the same time. I almost chose the ordinary explanation one last time. But I thought about Billy in Glendale with the story, and the story being real, and having led whatever was running the operation directly to the two people I was going to need. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm going to sleep at home. I'll call you first thing in the morning." She made me promise 3 times. I promised 3 times and meant it, and drove home. The first decision was not to go to Billy's that night, though I wanted to badly enough that I sat in my car in the Blockthorn parking structure for 11 minutes fighting it. The pull was genuine, the desire to drive to Glendale, to hand the whole situation to someone else, to sleep in a spare room under a reasonable person's roof, and wake up to bad drip coffee and a cat, and the possibility that I had been catastrophizing, and that the whole thing would look smaller in daylight. I almost went. But I thought about what it would mean if I were right. I thought about what it would mean to bring the story to Glendale, and the story turned out to be real, and I had led whatever was running this operation directly to the 2 people outside the affected area who were still themselves, and who I would need later. You don't spend your ammunition early. That is not a principle I had ever consciously held before that night, sitting in a parking structure in Burbank at 6 in the evening, but it was the principle I arrived at, and I think it was correct. I went home and I sat on my kitchen floor, not the couch, the floor, because the floor felt more honest somehow, the hardness of it grounding, and I thought about the plan on my desk. The one that was still alive because I had been too disorganized to throw it out and too involuntarily invested in its survival to let it die cleanly. The one that had not opened. I had assumed to that point that a pod that did not open was simply a failed pod, a defective delivery. I had been handing it what I thought of as substandard care, south-facing window, irregular watering, no particular system or expertise, nothing that would constitute real horticulture by any measure, and it had stayed alive without maturing because it was fighting to stay alive. Resources going to survival rather than to reproduction. That was the model I had been running. But Samantha had known it hadn't opened. Samantha, or whatever was operating Samantha's body and filing system and professional vocabulary, had brought me a ripe replacement pod rather than simply waiting for mine to eventually mature on its own. Which meant they had a timeline I didn't know about, and the unopened pod on my desk was a problem they were trying to solve on that timeline, rather than a failure they were willing to write off and wait out. Why was an unopened pod a problem? I thought about that for a long time in the kitchen dark. The neighbor's television went off. The street outside went quiet in the specific way Lowe's Angels goes quiet at 2 in the morning. Not fully silent, never fully silent, but the ambient noise dropping an octave into something more distant and less directional. And somewhere around 2:15, I arrived at a possibility that I immediately wanted to dismiss, because it required me to believe something that I have always considered a category error. That what I had been doing without intention or method or even real awareness had mattered to something that should not have been able to care whether it mattered. A pod that could not open could not replace its host. A pod that could not replace its host was a gap in the network, an unresolved variable, an unconfirmed node, a hole in whatever the replacement system was trying to build on this floor of this building in this part of this city. A pod that had been kept metabolically occupied for 2 weeks, kept busy surviving, kept drawing resources toward maintenance rather than reproduction, and had remained in sustained proximity to one specific human being throughout that time. That was something the design of the system had not, apparently, accounted for. Because why would it? The design assumption was straightforward. Pod arrives proximate to human, achieves maturity, opens, does its work. The design did not include a human who would water the thing and move it to the afternoon sun, and talk at it in the distracted, half-voiced way I talk at everything I'm not paying full attention to: my coffee, my monitor, my phone when it autocorrects me wrong. A murmuring, habitual, completely unintentional presence. The design did not include a host who would keep the pod biologically occupied for 2 weeks without triggering the replacement, until the pod had imprinted on her proximity in some manner that redirected its function. I do not have the science for this. I am a talent coordinator. What I have is the observation, the plant on my desk, when I went back to the office on Sunday morning because I had been worried about it and could not stop being worried about it, was different. Not dead, not ripe, something else, something in between and outside both categories. The membrane had gone pale amber, almost translucent in a different way than the ripening ones I had watched. The internal mass had changed in character from the dense, pressurized readiness I had seen in the pods before they opened to something that looked, in the most improbable word I can apply to it, relaxed. The fist had opened into something closer to a hand, the dense compression releasing into a looser arrangement, unhurried, no longer aimed. The striations on the outer membrane had faded to near invisibility. The stalk had shifted from rust red to a deep, warm ochre. And at the base of the stalk, where the soil met the clay pot wall, there was new growth, 3 small lateral shoots, barely an inch long, pale green at the tips, that had not been there Friday evening. When I held my hand near the pod, it moved toward my hand. Not much, a few millimeters. The movement was slow and unambiguous and entirely inconsistent with how plants move, which is to say it was not the slow phototropic lean of a plant following a light source over hours. It was a directed, deliberate, present-moment lean toward my specific hand. I watched it happen, and I stood very still in the empty Sunday office with my coffee going cold in my other hand and my heart doing something complicated in my chest that I did not have language for in the moment. I said out loud to a plant in an empty office on a Sunday morning, "Okay, what do we do now?" It did not answer. I had not expected it to. But the question was real, and I held it all through Sunday, and I drove to work Monday morning with my plant on the passenger seat in its pot, buckled in with the seat belt because it seemed wrong not to, because I was apparently now the kind of person who buckles in a plant. Monday started normally in the new normal, which meant with the precision of a system that had removed all its own friction. Phones answered on the first ring. Emails dispatched within minutes. Vikland moving through the bullpen with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of satisfaction that had the correct shape for what satisfaction looks like on a man in his position, but the wrong origin. No single malt. No mint breath. No particular indulgence or need of any kind. He stopped at my desk. "Melissa," he said, "Samantha mentioned you've been settling in." "Working on it," I said. He looked at the plan on my desk, back on my windowsill, in its spot, morning light hitting the ochre stalk and the amber membrane and the small green shoots at the base. The pod was oriented toward me with the same few millimeter lean it had held when I'd brought it in from the car. "I see your specimen is still with us," he said. "I've gone attached," I said. He looked at it for a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable. Then he looked at me. Then he said, "We all have our pace," and moved on, and I let out a breath very quietly through my nose and went back to my monitor. They left me alone for 4 hours. I answered phones. I routed calls. I submitted the revised photographer schedule. I ate my lunch at my desk, home packed, because the break room in the new normal had a quality I did not want to spend time in, the quiet of it too consistent, the conversation in it too appropriate, everyone taking exactly the break they needed and not 1 minute more. Frictionless, efficient, wrong. At 2 in the afternoon, Samantha came to my desk and stood beside it, and looked at the plant, and then looked at me. And something happened that I have spent a very long time trying to describe accurately, because accuracy matters to me, and this particular thing is not easy to be accurate about. The frosted glass quality in her face shifted. Not back to what she had been, not completely, not immediately. It was more like watching something approach the surface of water from below, where you can see the shape but it's still refracted by the medium between you. I watched it happen, and I did not say anything and I did not move, because something in me understood, in the way you understand things that are happening slightly faster than your conscious processing can fully track, that this was not the moment for language. Language would interrupt what was happening. So I held still and I let it happen. She stood there for 12 seconds. I know this because I counted, in the part of my brain that counts things when the rest of it is fully occupied elsewhere. Then she said, in a voice that had something rough in it, something abraded, something that had not been used in 2 weeks and was coming back to use like a door swung after being closed too long. I used to hum. I said, I know. She said, Bailey hummed too, not the same thing. A different thing. I could hear it from here and it used to drive me insane. I don't know why. It wasn't loud, it was just constant. I said, I know that too. She was quiet. She looked at the plant. The plant was oriented toward her now, the pod having completed a slow rotation in the time she'd been standing there, no longer leaning toward me but toward her, the amber membrane catching the afternoon light. What did you do to it? She said. It was not entirely a question. Watered it, I said. Put it in the light. Talked at it when I was distracted. Talked at it. I talk at things, it's a habit. I'm not proud of it. She reached out and touched the edge of the pot. Not the plant, the ceramic rim, with one finger, tentatively, the way you touch something you're not certain is safe. The plant moved. Toward her finger, the same directional lean it made toward my hand. Slow, certain, unhurried. Samantha made a sound that I cannot reproduce here. It was not a word. It was not crying, exactly. It was the sound a person makes when something returns to them that they had not known was gone, coming back faster than they were prepared for, arriving before they had built any structure to receive it. She made the sound and then pressed her lips together and looked at me, and there was something live and ragged and unambiguously hers behind her eyes. The specific heat that powered the specific competence, the engine back in the car. I don't know how long it lasts, she said quietly. Whatever that did, I can feel it that it might not hold. Then we'd better move, I said. What happened over the following several hours is the part of this account I have the most difficulty describing in terms of mechanism, because I cannot tell you what the plant was doing in any language that would satisfy a scientist. What I can tell you is what I observed, which is the only record I have. The pod had rotated when Samantha touched the pot, orienting toward the center of the bullpen rather than toward me or toward her. The amber membrane was at its most translucent it had ever been, not the near-bursting translucency of a ripening pod ready to open and disperse, but something different in quality, something more like the translucency of water rather than of pressure. And the mass inside had begun to pulse. Slowly, at intervals I eventually timed at approximately 40 seconds. Not light, there was no light. Not sound, there was no sound I could hear. Something below the threshold of sense, registered somewhere in the sternum rather than in any specific organ, something that I can only call presence. The way a room changes when someone enters it from a direction you can't see. The way you feel the weight of being watched before you identify who is watching. Andrew looked up from his desk at 2:47. He had been looking at his monitor for the preceding 3 hours with the smooth, uninterrupted focus of someone for whom focus is not an achievement but a state, no drift, no adjustment, no micro-rest. Now he looked up and his eyes moved to the plant, and then to his hands, and then to the drawer where he had kept his parking structure log. He opened the drawer. He looked at the log. He read 3 items off it, in a voice just barely audible across the bullpen. Then he stopped reading and looked at the plant and put his face in his hands and sat like that for a minute. And when he came out of it, his face had the particular quality of a man who has just confirmed a fear he had been refusing to hold directly. Casey found her antacid drawer at 3:15. She did not eat one. She held the roll in both hands and looked at it, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she looked at me from across the room with an expression that asked several questions at once that I answered by nodding once. Bailey hummed at 3:40. The tuneless fragment, the engagement signal, the sound I had not heard in 16 days. It came out of her without apparent intention. She was reading something, and the hum started the way it always started, from below conscious thought, from the place where concentration generates its own soundtrack. She caught herself, stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. She took her hand away. She let it come back. I will not inventory the whole afternoon because it would take longer to describe than it took to happen, and what it felt like to watch is beyond my ability to put into language that preserves it. I will say only that I watched 11 people come back to themselves over the course of several hours in an open-plan office in Burbank, California, one at a time, in no particular order I could have predicted. Some of them cried. Some of them did not. Some of them began talking very fast, the pressure of 2 weeks of unexpressed interior life releasing all at once, Andrew's parking structure theory, delivered in a torrent. Casey's deadline anxieties poured out in one continuous sentence. Bailey's hum, which she eventually stopped suppressing and let run until she felt steady enough to look at the rest of us. Vickland was last. He came out of his office at 4:30 and stood in the bullpen doorway and looked at the room. The room, by 4:30, was not the room he had been managing. The room was loud and messy and full of people in various states of emotional processing, which is to say the room was full of people. He stood in the doorway, and I could see the calculation happening in his face. Not his face yet, but the thing that had been running his face. The assessment of whether the situation was recoverable, whether a sufficient number of replacement pods could be deployed quickly enough, whether the variable in the corner who had somehow corrupted the network could be isolated and overridden. Then something changed in Vickland's face. Slower than the others, he had been under longer, or the imprint was deeper, or the thing that had been running him was more thoroughly established. It fought harder, but it gave. The composure fractured in a specific place, across the brow and behind the eyes, and what showed through was recognizable. The self-important exhaustion, the private vanity about the single malt, the complicated mixture of pride and disappointment in himself that had characterized Vickland for as long as I had known him. He blinked 4 times rapidly and gripped the doorframe with both hands, and looked at the false-bottomed credenza through the open office door, and then said, in his exact normal voice, complete with the slightly elevated diction of a man who has decided that how he speaks in the workplace is a form of distinction, "Someone want to tell me what in God's name has been going on around here?" Everyone started talking at once. I let them talk for 4 minutes. It was exactly what they needed. Then I put 2 fingers in my mouth and whistled, a skill my father taught me when I was 9, and that I had used perhaps 5 times in my adult life, but it cuts through any amount of ambient noise, and the sound of it in that office at that moment felt like reclaiming something. The room went quiet, and 12 faces turned toward me. "2 things," I said. "First, we document everything we can remember about the last 16 days, when each of you received your plant. Anything you recall about the transition, what it felt like going in or coming out, whether there's anything in between. Every detail, because I don't know what matters and neither do you." I looked around the room. "Second, we call people outside this building. People we trust who are not from the blast radius. They start making noise. Formal noise to people who can receive it in directions we cannot reach from in here." Samantha, who was already in motion, already thinking 3 moves ahead, said, "And the plant." I looked at my plant. The pod had gone still. The pulsing had stopped. The amber membrane was starting to dry at the edges, going papery. The new growth at the base, those 3 small lateral shoots, was still there, green and tentative and improbably alive. "Break room," I said, "center of the table. I keep watering it." I called Billy from Samantha's office at 4:55. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "Remember what I told you Saturday?" And she said yes, and I said, "I need you to start making noise," and she said, "What kind of noise?" And I said, "As much as you have." Billy has always been better at noise than I am. She contacted a journalist she knew from a previous job, who contacted 3 others, who started making calls to people at JPL and to 2 county supervisors' offices, and to a biocontainment researcher at USC, who had apparently been attempting to reach someone in an official capacity for 11 days and receiving no response. Within 48 hours, there were people in our building with credentials from agencies I could not identify who carried the specific quality of exhaustion belonging to people who have known something is wrong well before anyone was willing to say so publicly. I am not going to tell you the full aftermath. I don't have clearance for most of it, and the parts I do have clearance for are still under argument in rooms I am not invited into and probably never will be. What I can tell you is that the 48 hours after Billy started making noise were loud and fast, and not particularly comfortable for anyone, and that the people who came to the building with unidentifiable credentials were not warm or reassuring in their manner, but were at minimum very efficient, and that the experience of being debriefed at length by someone who takes notes without blinking is something I would not recommend but cannot honestly say I regret. I can tell you that the plants were collected, all of them, the opened and the spent and the ripe and the dying and the dead. That my particular plant was examined at some length by several people who touched it only with gloves and looked at me with expressions I chose to interpret as professional interest rather than alarm. That Blockthorn Associates was quietly dissolved in the weeks following, and its clients redistributed to agencies whose air filters had been tested and cleared. That 11 people on the 8th floor of a glass office tower in Burbank went back to being the specific, inconsistent, sometimes difficult, occasionally infuriating, irreducibly themselves versions of themselves that they had always been, and that this was, I cannot stress this enough, the most beautiful outcome I have ever had the privilege of being proximate to. I have thought about it many times since. I think about it when I am being inconsistent, when I am sighing too loudly at my monitor or forgetting something I told myself I would not forget, when I am eating cold food at my desk because I did not get around to taking a real break. I think, this is the thing. This is what I was fighting for, and this is what won. Samantha is doing better, in the way she always deserved to do better, running her own operation now under her name on her terms. She still exhales that specific thin exhalation when she picks up the phone and the person on the other end is behind where she needs them to be. I know this because we still talk regularly and I can hear it through the phone. Bailey still hums. Andrew still monitors the parking structure and has refined his B-level theory to a 17-minute window on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Casey has restocked the antacid drawer twice. These are not small things. These are the texture of people being people. And the plant. The plant is on my kitchen windowsill now, the south-facing one, where the afternoon comes through for 2 hours. The original pod is still on its arm, fully papery now, collapsed into its desiccated shell, done with whatever it did. But the new growth at the base continued. The 3 shoots became 6, and then 9, and they are rust-red now the way the original stalk was rust-red, and each one ends in a small closed formation that I have no name for. Not a pod exactly, not the same shape, not the same density. Something the plant grew out of what the plant learned, something that was not in the original design. I water them every other day, tilted glass at the edge of the pot. I don't know what they are. I am aware that this is the part of the story where a reasonable person hands the pot to the people with the unidentifiable credentials and lets the laboratory sort it out. I am aware that my continued attachment to this particular plant is not a sound basis for a containment policy, and that several people in rooms I'm not invited into have expressed this view. I have heard them out each time, and then continued watering the plant. Because here is what I know. Whatever was in that pod learned something from 2 weeks on a windowsill in an open-plan office in Burbank, California. It learned that the host wasn't going anywhere. It learned that the proximity was consistent and warm and ongoing and entirely without agenda, because I had no agenda. I was just a person who couldn't bring herself to let something die on her watch. It learned, in whatever way a thing without neurons learns anything, that there was an available relationship between itself and the person sitting next to it that was not consumption. That had not been in the design. The design had not included the possibility. I do not know if the new growth carries that learning forward. I do not know if it starts from that point or from scratch. I am sitting with that question in the way I sit with most questions I cannot resolve. Staying close, paying attention, not yet ready to call it. The afternoon light comes through the window at 1 o'clock. The plant leans toward it. I leave my hand near it sometimes, just to see. It still leans toward my hand. I think that counts for something. I think in the end, it is all I ever had to offer, not strategy, not equipment, not the right credentials or the right language or the right action at the right moment. Just the consistent, unremarkable, occasionally disorganized warmth of a person who could not bring herself to let something die because she had gotten attached without knowing she was getting attached, and who turned out to be the specific variable the design had not accounted for. The invasion was built around an assumption. The assumption was that humans would treat proximity as a convenience rather than a relationship, would tolerate a thing in their space without making anything of the tolerance, would keep the distance the design required. The assumption was wrong about me. I'm a person who finishes cold chamomile. I'm a person who keeps not getting around to throwing things out. I'm a person who talks at her monitor and her coffee and her phone, and as it turns out, at alien pods on the corner of her desk in a glass office tower in Burbank on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sun coming through the south-facing window for 2 hours. That's all it was. That's all it needed to be. That was enough.